I awoke in a pristine white cell of my own. Exhausted and starving, I tried to sit up, only to realize that I was bound to the bed by those thick leather straps. A panic like a dark tide immediately rose within me, and I began to struggle with what little energy I had left. It was only then that I realized I was completely naked above the sheet, so that all of me was exposed, and my body was eerily thin. I was extremely malnourished. My stomach's growling pained me, and even so much as moving caused my bones to ache. How long had I been there? How long had I gone without food, without water? My mind was hazy, but through the pain and agony my body remembered. My body remembered all too well. Suddenly, Mother Superior appeared at the end of the room. Her back was to me, and her body seemed to flicker in and out of existence like a candle's flame in a cool breeze. Unnervingly, she seemed to be praying as she faced the wall in complete, unbroken silence. I was terrified, but I was growing desperate, and she was the only one there with me. "Please," I cried. "Mother Superior, there's been a mistake. I am not possessed. I am a child of God." She remained deathly quiet and eerily still for a moment or two. Finally, she slowly began to turn around, revealing two gigantic black holes for eyes. Like Lucas, her thin skin was incredibly pale to the point where her darkened veins could be seen beneath it. In a flash, she had darted over to me, impossibly fast, causing me to shriek out in fright. She was then beside the bed, gazing down at me. With her so near, I could see that her mouth was actually sewn shut, bleeding from the flesh holes that had been stabbed through the skin just above and below her thin, bluish lips. It was then that she revealed a bloody knife, the cross-shaped blade, and began to cut away at the sutures. Once her mouth was free, she tilted her head and smiled, revealing thousands of sharp, bloody needle-like teeth, and she began to unhinge her jaw, causing the bones within her head to crack and pop unnervingly. Slowly she eased down, and I could smell the bits of rotting flesh that remained between her long, sharp, blood-stained teeth. Beyond that was an endless, empty darkness and depths of which I could not fathom. Despite my struggles, she wrapped her gigantic gaping mouth around my skull and clamped her countless needle-like teeth into my neck. The loud, unnerving singing of "There is a fountain filled with blood," one of my mother's favorite hymns, shattered me from this nightmare. It was indeed coming from my mother as she strained her already unpleasant voice to attempt to sing. "There was a fountain filled with blood, drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunged beneath that flood, lose all their guilty stains." The din violently broke through the thin walls of the house, sounding as if it were coming from the kitchen. I was in my bed, in my room, surrounded by my old childhood toys. The relief I felt to realize that it had only been a dream was like a drink of ice-cold water after wandering a scorching desert. It was time to get ready for school. "Joshua, breakfast is ready," my mother called. Finally, the sweet relief of silence filled the dark room, and I found myself wondering how Father Magnus was going to react to me today in class. Out of 11 other talented boys, including Levi, he had chosen me as his protege, and I fainted in the middle of my first exorcism. As I prepared to depart, my thoughts turned to Lucas. From my studies, I had learned that sometimes exorcisms did indeed end in death, but they also taught me that even death during an exorcism meant the victim's soul was saved. They were taken by God into heaven, and so I tried to be happy, telling myself that his suffering was finally over. At least I got to see him one last time, I thought, but my heart was broken. As we ate breakfast, my father told me that it was Father Magnus that had brought me home. He carried you in his arms and laid you down to sleep in your bed, even stayed with you for most of the night, just to make sure you were unharmed. Very admirable, I think. I remained silent, staring at the grayish-brown sludge on my plate, poking at it with my fork every few moments. Soon it was flooded with my tears. My head was filled with replaying memories of all the horror I had seen, my heart with the guilt that I felt, and whatever else I tried to focus on, my thoughts would always revert back to that. "And don't worry about failing, buddy," my father continued, silently reading his Bible at the table. "A lot of acolytes do. It's quite tough. The money would have been great for us, but I'm not certain that you're strong and brave enough for such a career in the church. You could always become a deacon like me, or the choir, or..." His voice faded into the background as he continued speaking. Again, I walked through the dilapidated remains of our fog-strangled village as I made my way to school. I passed by countless broken-down homes, seeing and hearing my neighbors arguing through their broken windows as I passed, retracing the steps I had taken countless times before. That day at Bloody Cross Omnideus School was nothing short of overwhelming, and every class, from scripture studies to religious science, my peers kept asking me how my trip to the convent went. One guy told me that his cousin was there because he confessed to headmistress Rebecca that he thought he was a girl. A young girl told me that her little sister was accused of witchcraft by the school's headmistress and was dragged out of the school by her hair. Another boy told me that he heard that 2 secret sodomites were caught in the act by headmistress Rebecca and were taken away a few years ago. None of them had been seen or heard from since. As they laughed and carried on, I couldn't help but see evil in their demented grins. These students' words terrified me, but their soulless eyes haunted me far beyond that day, and I had never missed my childhood friends as much as I did in those moments. By the time I finally got to my demonology class, I was exhausted to say the very least. Much to my surprise, however, Magnus didn't mention the exorcism to the class at all. Instead, he gave a full lecture on the demonic possession of inanimate objects, using a creepy porcelain doll as an example. It starts as an eerie energy, a negative emotional aura radiating from the item. I'm sure you all can sense it, he began, to which there was a mumbling of agreement from the class. I borrowed this lovely lady from Pastor Blackburn. He has a, collection of them. Everyone laughed at this as if it were a joke. The look in Magnus's eyes was strange, however. He seemed almost frightened of the very idea. I assumed this was because the pastor wasn't properly trained to handle such things, but the class went on as usual. No one brought up my exorcism at all. Even Levi acted as if nothing had happened, and I was relieved, until the bell rang, and Father Magnus asked me to stay for a bit. As the other students all scattered out into the hallway, I nervously walked over, gripping the strap of my backpack as it hung around my shoulder. My body began to sweat and tremble as the anticipation grew, fully expecting him to tell me that I didn't have what it takes, albeit in the nicest way humanly possible. My mind began to reel with dark possibilities. Joshua, I was very pleased to see you in class today. I want you to understand that everyone's first exorcism is hard, he began, tilting his head. He was sitting on his desk as I stood before him. Mine was too. I don't want this to discourage you from pursuing your dreams. My eyes were locked onto those of the porcelain doll standing next to him on his desk. Her face was covered in spiderweb-like cracks. She was dressed in what looked like a pilgrim's dress, with her long brunette hair and thick curls. But what frightened me the most was her massive, crying blue eyes, which seemed to stare into my very soul. And within them, somehow, I saw Lucas. No, it won't, I said, turning my attention back to my master. I was afraid you were going to dismiss me as your protege. I fainted, of all things, but of course I'm remaining in the program. He grinned widely, seemingly just as relieved as I was. That is great to hear, he said, standing up. Moving forward, I'd like to leave you with one piece of advice. Never listen to the demons, especially when they're talking through someone you love. You can't trust what you see or hear during an exorcism. Remember that. In his mid-20s, Magnus had an energy about him that was positive and comforting. Neatly trimmed scruff perfectly framed his full lips, and his thick brows were always arching as he smiled at me. That ginger red hair was always perfectly coiffed, and behind his black-rimmed glasses, his sparkling green eyes were full of wisdom. Despite the unnerving glare of his porcelain companion, my master's words had somehow filled me with the determination I needed to continue. Excuse me. This would be a skill of his that would increasingly aid me in my most darkest of times to come. Unfortunately, Levi sought to undo all of that. As soon as I left the room that day, he began to outright bully me. Apparently, he had eavesdropped on my previous conversation because he called me a coward and then asked if I were going to faint because of it in a whiny, mocking tone. His new male friends all laughed behind him, struggling to seem as masculine and stoic as humanly possible. Other than being the best in class, he was mostly known for stealing wine from the church and getting drunk with those jackasses in the cemetery. That and making jokes out of the other students, and each prank he pulled was more hurtful than the last. It seemed as though he thought himself untouchable because his mother was the headmistress. Pride goeth before the destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall, after all. However, on the way out of school that day, I was stopped by her. She hadn't apparently been eavesdropping during my conversation with her spoiled son, and she asked me how I had felt about it. Well, honestly, it offended me, I admitted, knowing this was exactly what she wanted to hear. She chuckled to herself. Well, if you don't want to be called a coward, she began strutting around me, perhaps you shouldn't be so cowardly, or, find a more suitable career path. Her dark eyes then lit up as she smiled. There's always an opening at the church's kitchens, I hear. I shook my head. No, thank you, headmistress, I stated, already walking away from her. I want to become an exorcist. She scoffed behind me. Joshua! Don't you dare walk away when you're being spoken to, she shrieked, watching me walk out of the front door to the school. I could hear her running to catch up with me. She stopped the door from closing between us and reached out. Roughly grabbing my hand, she jerked me back toward her, and when I turned back to face her, I saw the face of a madwoman. Headmistress Rebecca, I really have to get home. The headmistress cackled as I continuously tried to pull away from her. I can assure you, Joshua, that not a single ounce of me cares, she growled. Over the years, you've been written up and sent to my office for daydreaming, outright ignoring your teachers, and not paying attention. In multiple classes, mind you. I'm certain that it wouldn't take much for me to convince the council to evaluate you. Do you want to experience the stay in the convent yourself? This terrified me. I stopped struggling. I'm sorry, headmistress, I apologized. I just have to get home and make dinner for my parents. That's all. This wasn't a lie. I had been doing all the cooking and cleaning around the house for years at that point. She released her witch's talon grip on my arm, but her wicked glare remained burning into my very soul. She was absolutely seething. Do not anger me again. This will be your only warning, she growled through clenched teeth. In the meantime, I'll pray for you to overcome this desire to disrespect your betters. Now do me a favor and get out of my sight. I did as she demanded, and I did so in a hurry. Sometimes I find myself wondering why Levi had changed so much from when we were children. We had always played a bit rough, but he was never mean to me before. What had I done to him to make him hate me so? And then I would have to suffer through a conversation with his wicked mother, and I would remember I had done nothing at all. He had simply learned this behavior from her. Lucas's funeral was held soon after that. It was an open casket, despite the fact that he looked so ill and broken. The fake flowers surrounding the pulpit did little to brighten the day. I tried my best to keep the image in my mind of him as a child, laughing and playing, but it didn't seem to be helping. He didn't even seem peaceful as he lied there, pale as a ghost. As I gazed down upon him, tears filled my eyes. I was so lost in my childhood memories that I didn't realize my old friends had gathered around. Esther, Magdalena, even Levi were all quietly mourning alongside me. Soon, despite the fact that we had not spoken to one another in years, the girls both put their arms around me and rested their heads on my shoulders. Levi was not as empathetic, however. You didn't tell me it was Lucas, he growled through clenched teeth. He then turned to me. You fainted during Lucas's exorcism instead of helping him? I scoffed. Levi, it was my first real experience with the demonic, and seeing him like that, I looked away for a moment. It scarred me. He smirked and crossed his toned arms. All the more reason you shouldn't be an exorcist, he snarled, walking away from me. Walking toward me. Pressing a firm finger to my chest to continue. How many more people are going to die because of you? Hearing these words, I gasped. Tears filled my eyes as I looked up into his irate brown eyes, but somehow even then I knew it wasn't really me he was angry with. Levi, leave it alone, Esther demanded, stepping between us. It was then that I noticed the wedding ring on her finger. We all lost Lucas. Don't take your pain out on Joshua. Hearing this, Levi was even more enraged. It was his responsibility to make sure Lucas came home safely, he shouted. His dark eyes shut over to me once again. You were supposed to heal him, not kill him. In that moment, Esther stepped before me to face off against him. Her brows were furrowed, and in her eyes there raged flames of righteous fury. Before she had time to continue taking up for me, however, an elderly man appeared from the small number of attendees. He placed his hand on her shoulder and gripped it tightly, not unlike how Blackburn had done to Lucas all those years ago. Come sit down, my darling, he said, his voice strained by age. I grow weary of watching you argue with your friends. She gulped. Keeping her eyes locked onto me, she nodded. Yes, my love. With that, she turned around and made her way back to the pews. She's married? I asked confusedly. Levi scoffed and shook his head. You'd know that if you hadn't abandoned us all, he grumbled, walking away. I watched him return to the sparse group of people in the pews. Turning my attention to Magdalena, I arched my brows and tilted my head. I abandoned you? I asked, trying to remember why it was that I stopped spending time with them. The only answer that made sense to me was that I had prioritized my studying over maintaining my friendships, which was true. Magdalena offered a kind smile and shrugged her shoulders. She had been born mute and usually used her talent of drawing to communicate. It was easier than writing things out for her. Even that day at Lucas's funeral, she had her pen and sketchpad in hand. Instead of trying to draw something for me as an explanation, however, she simply touched my arm and motioned towards the pews with her head before taking her leave. Taking note of the detailed drawing of a Dybbuk in her grasp, I followed, and the funeral began shortly thereafter. Unsurprisingly, Pastor Blackburn used it as an excuse to preach about honoring God, insinuating that what happened to Lucas was simply the consequences of his own actions. I sat with my parents, squirming uncomfortably, his words hitting my ears like a child violently banging on piano keys. Doing my best to ignore it, I looked down at my copy of the pamphlet the deacons had given out. On its cover was a beautifully detailed portrait of Lucas as I remembered him, signed by Magdalena herself. This made me smile, and so I tried to focus on my happy memories of him. I thought of the time we played hide-and-seek in the church. He hid in the confessional, which was the last place we all thought to look. And when we all had a drawing contest with Magdalena as the judge, he won with a drawing of us all holding hands. Recalling the time we were playing good guys versus bad guys, he made me chuckle as he tried to scare us by jumping out from behind the angel statue, roaring like a dragon. And I remembered when his parents took his favorite doll away, Esther made him a new one out of her mom's scrap cloth, and Magdalena drew it a pretty face. He loved that little rainbow doll and carried it around everywhere. It was present in most, if not all, of the most joyful memories I had of him, as well as our childhood drawings in Miss Mary's classroom. Though he had to hide it from his parents as they thought it sinful for some reason for a boy to play with a traditional girl's toy, but I hadn't seen it since he disappeared as a child. I found myself wondering what had become of it. Soon I became distracted, however. As Blackburn continued to preach, his face slowly began to sort of melt off of his skull. His eyes glowed a brilliant yellow, and he began to transform, his bones snapping within his body as his back dramatically curved, and his fingers grew eerily thin and long. The spiky bones of his spine stabbed through his robes, revealing his naked, mangled form. Flames burst up from the floor around him, silhouetting him completely. He then turned directly to me and spoke in a deep, guttural, inhuman voice. Then shall he say unto them on the left hand, Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. And suddenly, in the blink of an eye, everything was normal again. Looking around, I saw that no one had reacted to the horrific scene at all. It was as if I were the only one that could see it. Feeling a dark panic rising within me, I made my departure from the funeral. Despite my horned shadow, it wasn't the devil that was speaking through Blackburn, I thought. It was God. His wrath was apparent. He knew of the thorn in my side, my secret temptations, and was warning me of the consequences should I give in. So I promised myself that no matter what, I wouldn't so much as entertain such thoughts. By the time the next exorcism came around, I was more than ready. I had my rosary around my neck and my notepad and pen in hand, and as Magnus and I made our way through that dizzying and unnerving convent, I bravely smiled at every silent sister we passed by. My courage didn't appear to be enough, however, as with every case, it, along with my optimism, depleted more and more. Each exorcism I witnessed was sadder than the last, from a black man who was taught he'd become white in heaven, to a woman who was raped by a priest and called Jezebel for tempting him. I faced the heartbreaking stories of many possessed individuals. All of them were sickly, malnourished, and seemingly out of their minds. Some of them were even missing limbs, the explanation for which was always the same. There was an infection, and amputation was the only option. I did my best to comfort them until Magnus deemed them released of the devil's grasp. That was, if they survived. It became a habit of mine to seek out Miss Mary after particularly grueling exorcisms. Magnus was good at giving advice, but it was she that had always comforted me when I was afraid as a child. And when I would find her, she did so during my training as well. In between showing off the beautiful Bible story illustrations she had recently commissioned for Magdalena. Unlike my parents, she supported and uplifted me, something that I so desperately needed at the time. Since the incident with the snake, however, sometimes she'd go missing for months to a year at a time. The explanation of that was always the same. Miss Mary was out in the world, spreading the word of God and aiding those less fortunate. After fighting and surviving her way through the dead wood, she was out there preaching to the depraved masses and feeding the homeless, giving them an option, a second chance at life. And the souls she saved were to return with her into the loving, welcoming church, born again with new names, their sinful histories wiped clean so that they would not be viewed any differently than the rest of us. When I could not find her, I still stayed in the shadows of her classroom, the very same one I'd spent countless days of my youth, learning all the classic Bible stories from Adam and Eve to Noah and the flood to Moses rescuing his people. It still smelled of her flowery perfume, and I could almost hear an echo of her infectious laughter, and when reminiscing didn't ease my sorrows, I'd pray to God, asking him to watch over her wherever she was. Thinking of her inspired me to do more to help those in need. This is why I began sneaking food and water into the convent to give to the possessed. Even cleaning them up was something I was more than happy to do. At first, Father Magnus did not approve, but after a while he began to see just how much of an improvement they were making because of it. It was literally bringing them back to life, and so he began to help me in secret, but warned me not to let anyone know, as it wasn't our place as exorcists to provide such services. It was supposedly the Silent Sisters that handled all of that, but instead of simply feeding and bathing them, I had a feeling the pale nuns were focusing more on the secret treatments they were known for. Some of the possessed even have bleeding, oozing bed sores, which Magnus would yell at the Mother Superior about. Her silent glares were the only answer we ever received, however. That horned shadow continued to haunt me. I could see it out of the corners of my eyes, within the convent, within the church, within the school, even my parents' house. I could see its silhouette in the ever-present fog outside, its blood-red glare following me wherever I went like a snake ready to strike. But nothing else dramatic occurred, other than the ragged, deep voices of the possessed and the vulgarity they'd sometimes spew when stressed and frightened. Each exorcism was simple, and most of them survived. Eventually, I had gone from observing exorcisms to assisting them. In between each case, I was slowly growing from a boy into a man. One particular night, I found myself making my way through the fog as I headed to the church. My plan was to spend some time with Miss Mary and to talk to her about my upcoming graduation. I never made it inside, however. Levi was sitting on the stairs drinking from a jug of wine. His dress shirt was unbuttoned and stained burgundy from his sloppy drinking. Beside him, his jacket was strewn over the stairs and his tie was missing entirely. Shaking my head, I approached. "Levi, that wine is for communion," I stated in monotone, already annoyed by his very presence. His glare, like a dagger, stabbed through my heart. "It was supposed to be me," he growled. "I was supposed to become an exorcist." Furrowing my brows, I shook my head. "You still can," I said, studying him through a squint. "No, I can't. I won't," he shouted. "I left the program entirely, and now I'm leaving the church itself, and do you know why?" I switched my gaze between his dark eyes, realizing that they were glistening with tears. "Levi," I said, shaking my head, "this is just the devil whispering to you in the shadows, trying to lure you in. He tries to get me sometimes too, but as long as you stay in God's light." He laughed loudly, obnoxiously. "That's all bullshit, Joshua," he growled, raising a single brow. "I left because none of it is real. My faith in exorcism, my faith in the church, my faith in God, all dead. But what I want to know is, after everything you've seen, how is yours still intact?" Chills danced down my arms as I studied his handsome face for a moment. I watched his thick, full lips curl up into a smirk, surrounded by that prickly facial hair. Time seemed to slow down as I began to wonder what they tasted like. Hearing him chuckle again, I blinked and met his eyes again. I just do as I'm told," I admitted. You just do as you're told," he mumbled, seeming confused. He then threw the jug of wine onto the ground, shattering at once. "You just do as you're told?" He stumbled over to me and grabbed my forearms with his hand, squeezing them tightly. "Those people in that convent drink their own urine because they were deprived of water, but you just do as you're told. They lie in their own feces because the nuns refuse to clean them, but you just do as you're told. They eat insects that are attracted to their waste because it's better than the rotting food those same nuns present to them once a week, if they're lucky, but you just do as you're told." With every word as he spoke, he shook me as if it would help me comprehend the gravity of the situation. The physicality of this affected me in some way. It sent me back to a time when we were children, and I remembered how rough we would play back then. We would spend entire afternoons throwing rock-hard dirt clods at each other in the fog. This would usually end in us wrestling in the mud until one of us had had enough, and a truce would be struck that would only last for about 10 minutes. Then we would be fighting again, but the entire time we would be laughing and grinning, despite the pain, despite the bruises, welts, and cuts we left on one another. Magdalena laughed at us. She even drew us wrestling once or twice. Esther was of the opinion that our violence was stupid and had no qualms about letting us know. Lucas was always afraid that we were going to hurt each other, and so he was usually begging us to stop. He was ever the sensitive one. I suppose even as kids, Levi and I were always trying to outdo one another. Then it was our thresholds of pain. In school it was our studies. After that it was our priesthood and earning the title of exorcist. But what would our competition become now that everything was changing and we were on the precipice of adulthood? The sweet scent of the wine on his breath drifted into my nostrils, intoxicating me. As I gazed into his dark eyes, I found myself wondering if I had left his muscular body as scarred as he'd done mine. "Levi," I managed, reaching up and touching his hands with my own. I wrapped them around his wrists, but I did not try to pull him away from me. In truth, I was simply wanting to touch him. His grip loosened as he searched my eyes for the answer I could not verbalize. "Has your heart not shattered beneath the weight of these people's tragic stories?" he demanded. "Has your mind not broken trying to make sense of these laws and rules we're taught? Do you not feel an ache in your bones, a longing in your soul for something more, something real, something tangible?" With every word he shouted, my panic deepened. Before he finished, it felt as if I were drowning within it. "Yes!" I yelled, my voice echoing into the night as I tore myself away from him. "But I'm terrified, Levi." Everything grew quiet as I tried to catch my breath. "I'm terrified." He swallowed and slowly shook his head, looking at me through widened eyes. "So am I, Joshua," he said, facing forward, "but it sure as fuck isn't of some devil whispering to me in the shadows." With that, he turned around and began to walk away. "Levi," I began. Seeing him stop, I took a deep, shaky breath as tears filled my eyes. I can't tell if the demons I've been seeing are real or in my head, or if it's reality that's shattering around me, or my sanity within me, or perhaps the actual demon is roaring in the pulpit every Sunday, but I have an inkling of which one is the truth. He shook his head. His back was to me at that point. Then follow me, he stated through clenched teeth, shooting a glare back at me from his cocked head. Follow me into the darkness and we'll search for the light, together. Desperate to keep him near, I stepped forward, reaching out and grabbing his arm. No, Levi, you can't leave the village, I shouted, stopping him in his tracks. The world outside is dangerous. He gazed up into the gray skies above. After a moment or two of silence, he turned back to me. Miss Mary seems to return all but unscathed after each and every one of her missions, he offered, shrugging his shoulders. Listen, Joshua, if I stay here after what I've done, I'll be locked in that convent forever. Hearing such words, I was overcome with emotion. His mention of Miss Mary did little to ease my concerns as well. She was the smartest, strongest person I knew. If anyone could survive out there with both her soul and body intact, it was her. Tears streamed down my face as I took Levi's hands into my own. Pray tell, what have you done that is so unforgivable? His dark eyes shot up to mine at once. I blasphemed against God before both my mother and Father Isaac, he stated sternly. After my last exorcism, my assigned afflicted passed away. He looked down to the ground, the sorrow returning to his eyes. My mother said that his death was what God wanted, and Father Isaac agreed, and I looked to both of them and told them that sometimes God seems like an evil bastard. My heart sank as I heard these words. Please don't go, I begged. Blasphemy was a certain sign of demonic possession, but all he had to do was turn himself in, claim he was grieving at the time, accept that he didn't have what it takes to become an exorcist, and pretend to be regretful. A week's stay and a few Hail Marys and he would have been released. Of this I was certain. But at the same time, I knew his pride didn't allow him to lie. He truly believed that God was evil and that he was going to take it back. And he wasn't going to take it back. Turning back to me, he arched his brows. Still crying, he shook his head. Quietly and gently, he touched his warm fingertips to my face and began to wipe my tears away. Your eyes look like his. Blue, deep, endless like the ocean, he whimpered, sounding completely broken-hearted. I don't want to lose you too. Come away with me, Joshua. Once again, I lost myself in the depths of his mysterious eyes. Within them, I pondered over his invitation. Images of he and I laughing and playing again like we did as children filled my mind. But this fantasy was soon shattered by the echoes of my parents' words warning me of the dangers of the world beyond our village. Here, around the church, we are all protected by God's love, my father always said. Over time, it had become a sort of bedtime story for me. But within the dead wood and beyond, there are toxins in the air that will make you sick. Out there, you will slowly weaken, sleep will not be restful, and food will not nourish you. Your skin will boil and your lungs will burn as you try to breathe, and eventually, if you do not make it back in time to his grace, you will die. And should you somehow make it to the surrounding cities, my mother would continue, tucking me into bed, you will be shocked at the depravity of their citizens, if you aren't a victim of it yourself. They are places of evil and sin, like Sodom and Gomorrah. If you survive there, it will be at the cost of your morals, your dignity, and your mortal soul. Then they would kiss my forehead and make me say my nightly prayers. Now I lay me down to sleep, I would whisper, my mind plagued with visions of disease and debauchery. As I repeated the rhyme, they would blow out the candles in my room and leave me alone in the darkness for the night, and the darkness would plague my nightmares. Trying not to lose myself within my own imagination, I blinked and shook my head. Gazing into Levi's eyes once more, I shed one final tear that night. I'm sorry, Levi, I whispered, my voice breaking under the weight of my fear, but I must stay here. He nodded solemnly. I understand. I do. This is all you've ever known, he said, motioning around us. I've stood where you stand now, and I know that no matter what I say, you're still going to cling to your beliefs. You'll have to see the truth yourself in order to believe it. My brows furrowed in confusion. Cocking my head to the side, I studied him for a moment. What truth is that, Levi? He did not answer. Instead, he took a deep, shaky breath and gazed into my eyes for a moment or two. I'm sorry, Joshua, for making fun of you, for letting my competitive spirit get the better of me, for everything, he apologized, wiping his tears away. I'll take my leave now, but promise me one thing before I go. Suddenly, his eyes were even darker. He seemed to be more stoic and serious. Don't become an exorcist. You'll live to regret it. At least, I hope you will. He then walked away and disappeared into the fog, leaving me softly weeping on the steps of the church. Every ounce of my being screamed, raged, burned to follow him. There seemed to be 1,000 questions churning in the stormy sea of my mind that I so desperately wanted to ask him. I yearned to fight him like I did when we were young, to beat him with clods of dirt, to punch him, to kick him, to bite him, to claw him, to scream and to cry as I asked him, why? Why had he tried so fervently to burn the bridge of our childhood friendship, only to eventually try and help me help me over the raging river it once stood over? Why did he seem so traumatized by everything? Why did it seem as though he were holding back in his explanations? Why did he think I would regret completing my goals? Why did the choice of what could have been a short stay in the convent seem more difficult for him than running away and facing the possibility of horrible sickness and painful death? These questions burned inside of me, but I simply and silently sat down on the steps and stared into the fog where his silhouette disappeared. I'd lost yet another friend. Somehow this one hurt just as much as Lucas's death. My heart was crippled, my mind was plagued, but there was so much more loss, more pain that I was yet to endure. And that was chapter 3. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I think that's all I'm going to film today. If you like this, I'm also reading scary stories. These videos premiere... That was chapter 2, I apologize. These premiere Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays. This will be Monday's episode, I think. I'm also reading Scary Stories Tell in the Dark, the children's books for Halloween. And I'm also doing gaming videos, anything, basically all horror, all month long. And I love you guys, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!
We were dead a long time ago. We've been ghosts since days of old. We were dead a long time ago. We're the ghosts of the stories you've told. We were dead a long time ago. We've been ghosts since the days of old. We were dead a long time ago. Ghosts in the scary stories you've told. Shadows in the moonlight. Creatures in the trees. Glowing eyes surround.